So what do you take into consideration when you're given the responsibility of housing a high-profile suspect?
Well, it's not just a high-profile suspect. It's every inmate that we get in. Our priority is to maintain safety, safety for the inmate, safety for the other inmates, safety for my staff. That's the priority that we have. No matter who he is, could be the poorest individual from the county or the most wealthy individual.
Gotcha. Now, what was your paramount concern when you were given custody of Jeff Epstein?
Well, I think, we were given Mr. Epstein under conditions that we were not used to. Instead of being sent to a state prison, it was negotiated between the federal government and the state that he would serve his time at a county jail, which was ours. So we took them aboard, and we provided the services that we provide all the other inmates. And we processed them just like we would any other inmate, with special precautions. And the precautions is because of his extreme wealth, his notoriety, his legal staff that he had was enormous, but we made him follow every criteria that every other inmate had to follow.
And when you say there were special precautions, what were they, if you could elaborate on that?
Well, we maintained and we kept him in a position. When he first came in, he was first brought in, I believe it was in '06, and spent the night, was released the next day by the courts. Mr. Epstein came to us for one night and spent the night and went to court the next day on his charges, was released. He then returned in July of '08, and that's when he was brought from the courthouse. It was called a recommit, transported by our deputies from the courthouse to the main detention center here, was held overnight. He went through classification, he went through medical, and the next day he was transported to the stockade by our deputies.
And were you there when he first arrived?
No.
Okay. And so he also, I had heard that he spent a night in the infirmary before being transferred to the stockade. I mean, if you can kind of elaborate on that, why that happened.
Well, sure, and that happens a lot. We're an agency, this is Palm Beach County, Florida. We have had politicians, elected officials, movie stars, family of movie stars, some of the richest people in this county. We have had drug cartel operators. They're all handled the same way, only with extra precautions. We use the infirmary at a time like that when we needed to keep him away until we could find out what the classification and everything. So we placed him overnight in the infirmary until he was transported the next day to the stockade. Well, we occasionally will put a high-profile individual into the infirmary, into a cell in the infirmary, temporarily until we can classify him and get him into another position that's best suited for that individual.
And the reason is?
To keep safe. As I've said many, many times, it's our job to keep everyone safe.
Okay. And so the same was done with Jeff Epstein?
Right, exactly.
Okay, and so can you describe where he was, what happened? He was moved at one point, he was housed at the stockade, did he have his own wing? You know, if you can kind of set the scene for what...
Well, I've heard those rumors. I've heard that he was given the suite. He was not. He was placed in T-dorm, which is a segregated area. It has 16 cells in there. And those who are there for disciplinary reasons and or segregation issues for a keep safe, whether they're informants, whether their classification says that they need to be isolated or they have asked for protective custody. That's where they would be. So that's what we did. He was given an individual cell with a metal bed, a metal sink, and a metal toilet, with a 10-inch by 10-inch window. He was kept in that cell, but then we needed a houseman, and his behavior was excellent. He had no issues with Mr. Epstein at all. He was allowed to be a houseman, which is his requirements as a houseman is just to sweep the floor, mop the floor, collect the dinner trays, wash the windows, wash the windowsills, pick up the dirty linen and replace it with clean linen to all the different inmates. So he handled those duties as a houseman.
And he was fine with that, and he didn't complain that he had
He
to?
never complained once. I'm told by the corrections officers that provided his security that there was no complaints whatsoever on Mr. Epstein.
So as a houseman, he did his job pretty well, would you say?
Absolutely, yes. As I'm told.
Okay. And so let's talk about the work release. And I know that, there's been a lot out there, so let's kind of set the record straight. On what basis was he given work release?
Mr. Epstein was given work release, just like that he qualified for immediately upon his entry. That every other inmate would be given the same privileges if they met the parameters. There was some concern, and we had a meeting with his attorneys, and we wanted to set additional parameters for his work release. We added, in conjunction with his attorney's agreement, we added a GPS ankle monitor that tracked every movement that he would have off campus at our stockade. In addition to that bracelet contained what we call SCRAM capabilities, which is an alcohol testing process. So that if he had any alcohol, that would come through and notify us immediately. We also had the ability to block the addresses of the 2 listed victims that we had and set up perimeters around their homes, so if he came anywhere close to one of those addresses, we would be immediately alerted.
So you said that he followed the qualifications to go on work release. What are those qualifications?
Well, they're numerous, and there's a whole list of those. If you want, I would have to go over those. It would take us about 15 minutes.
Sure.
But he met every one of those parameters, and we set those additional conditions for that. Work release is a typical process for us today. Years ago, in the 70s and early 80s, we did not have work release. The attitude today and over the years now is to release inmates and not make them stay in jail. By giving them work release, they can provide for their families. They have careers, they have jobs that they can go to when they're released. So it's a reentry issue that benefits not only the inmate, it benefits the community as well, and it benefits their families. But there are parameters, and they're very closely watched. We have an entire alternative custody unit that monitors them, that visits them at their work site, and just to make sure that everything is the way that we have agreed upon in their conditions of their alternative custody.
Okay. And so who typically gets work release? What types of offenders?
Just could be anybody. We've had John Goodman received house arrest. We've
The
had
actor?
John Goodman, no, the air conditioning air
Okay.
that was involved in a fatal car accident. Just about anybody. We've had judges give house arrest and work release to people with violent crimes and who are closely monitored as well. But your average inmate is given that work release. He's a convicted misdemeanor. Some convicted felons who are spending a time with us are given those privileges.
And then also, we talked about this, the terms of the work release, but some people are just surprised because you can kind of, that there, as you said, and that's interesting, that some that are even considered violent offenders or, that type of thing are allowed to come and go. And, as you know, I mean, you're well aware that there was some, when people hear that, and we can clear this up, that they say he was a registered sex offender, but he was on prostitution charges. Is that correct?
He was brought to us on prostitution charges, 2 counts. So, and we had 2 victims. When he was given house arrest, or not house, work release, we notified those 2 victims by letter and notified them that he was being given work release. So
that was part of, as you said, that was part of the parameters.
That was part of the parameters, along with that. Just to give me I'll give you a couple highlights on his work release. He was picked up by a driver. The driver had to prove he had a license, they had insurance, and was not a convicted felon. That driver then took him directly to his office, where he was met with a permit deputy that he paid for, who then made sure that all the parameters of that work permit were met by Mr. Epstein. He was not allowed to have family, friends, guests at his office. The only ones that were allowed to visit him were his attorneys or his business partner. And and there was a sign-in sheet, and it was very closely monitored by our team. He was allowed to go to a doctor, but the deputy had to accompany him to the doctor or to his lawyer's office. He did not have free time to wander. He was not allowed to go out for lunch. He had to stay in that office the entire time.
Okay. And were there hours?
It was generally 8 to, Mr. Epstein was given the hours, 12 hours, 8 to 8. And many times he returned early. He did not stay the entire 12 hours.
Okay. And so did you ever meet Epstein yourself?
Briefly, just in passing. So.
Okay. If you can just kind of tell me like what your impressions of him were.
Well, first impressions, he was an inmate. What is your impression of an inmate? I only knew what I was told by my staff, that he was cooperative, he was friendly, he created no issues whatsoever during his incarceration period. So.
And what was when you said you briefly met him, what was your...
He was friendly. Was not disrespectful. What more can I say?
No, that's it. I know, because he wasn't, people are just interested to hear, since he doesn't do interviews. It's kind of like anyone that meets him, it's like, oh, what was he like? Did you hear, did he interact with other inmates, or?
He did very well. Many times inmates will have conflict, but there was not one conflict reported in that T-dorm while he was there between him or any other inmate.
Interesting. Now, if he had posed a problem, were there kind of steps in place in terms of what would have happened? Like, would his work release be taken away, or if you can talk about that?
If Mr. Epstein would have violated any condition of that work release, and which was like 2 pages almost, then he would have immediately been arrested and taken into custody and brought back to the stockade, and all privileges would have ceased.
And so, around how many deputies were assigned to him, would you say?
Well, on the permit details, the deputies varied because it's a off-duty work assignment. So, but there was 464 reports filed by permit deputies. And the permit deputies had strict guidelines to follow as well that were set not only by corrections, but by the permit office as well. And one of the things that they had to do is when they arrived at Mr. Epstein's place, they had to call their sergeant or lieutenant to let them know that they were there. And that's something that we've done with like the high-profile individuals like Epstein or Goodman. So very carefully guarded. Each deputy had to file a report on any activity that occurred during that day.
And as you said, what types of reports did you ever get to see them? Did they, what would kind of be a typical report that they might?
Well, that Mr. Epstein had his lawyer visit, that Mr. Epstein went home early, that Mr. Epstein had no guests during the day, that Mr. Epstein went to a doctor and was accompanied by the permit deputy. Those are the kind of things that were in those reports.
Okay. Do you have those reports here?
I printed out 20 at the beginning,
okay,
20 in the middle, and 20 at the end.
for us to, we can kind of.
So you could give an idea
Fantastic. Okay.
what they had to
I
say.
think we touched on this, but just to be clear, so whose decision is it whether or not someone gets work release?
I think it's the team. We had an entire team meet. In my office, we met with the majors, captains, and folks involved in the process. And we went over all the terms, what we expected, what the rules were, and what the added conditions would be. And then the decision was made that he met the parameters and he was eligible for work release. It was 3.5 months before he was given work release. So he didn't come in, Mr. Epstein did not immediately receive work release. We went through the entire processes and looked at all of the avenues that we felt were important, and with not only meetings with our staff that were involved in this, but one meeting with his attorneys, and it was a 3.5 month process before he was released to work release.
Okay, so that I think that's important, because I think that it's a misperception that he immediately came in, right, and was
Right.
out.
The perception also was that Mr. Epstein was given a suite. It's not a condition that you or I would want to live in.
The one that right,
Where
as
he
you
was
described,
in
the cell,
T-dorm.
yes.
That is not a pretty place. In fact, his lawyer visited there and was very unhappy with the confines of T-dorm.
And did you, was there a conversation about that?
With
him
the
being
attorney,
unhappy?
yes, with the attorney.
What was kind of the gist of
Well,
that
they didn't.
conversation?
They thought it was very sparse, and but that it's a jail. This is not the Hilton. This is not the Marriott. This is the Palm Beach County Jail, and we have everything in place to keep everyone safe.
Did they ask, could he be moved somewhere else or something like that?
I don't think so. After we explained that this is what it was, and it was a segregated area, a segregated dorm, that any complaint went away.
Anything else that you want to add that you feel like is a misperception, or that just it's maybe things that people don't know about the situation?
Well, I'm just saddened that some people think that it was corruption, that he was given all these privileges because of his wealth. It was not so. I mean, he was made to jump through extra hoops and meet additional requirements because of his wealth that others are not mandated to do during their work release. But we received this from the federal government and from the state, and he was given to us to provide his sentence with, and we did the very best we could under the parameters that we had.
And what were the parameters as you understood them?
Well, that he did his time that he was assigned to. He was given game time because of his good behavior, just like every other inmate would have been.